Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Wholegrains Week. My name is Kathy Lamakia, and I am the General Manager for the Grains and Legumes Nutrition Council. And I have with us today Professor Eleanor Beck, who definitely does not need an introduction. I'm sure most of you know her very, very well. And she is going to spend some time with us today to talk through supporting the whole grain intake, seeking consistency with messaging. So at that point, I'll hand over to Eleanor if you would like to say a few words about yourself, and then obviously jumping into your presentation.
Great, thanks, Kathy. So for those of you who don't know me, I am a dietitian, and I came to work in the space of whole grains and dietary fibre and cereals in general, mostly through commencing a PhD in the area. I'm trying to think how long ago that was, only about 16 years ago. And I think it's a really important lesson to people. Sometimes people say, if you want to go on and do future study, it has to be some area you're passionate about. And my argument would be, if you just generally like it and you think the methods and techniques are okay, then sometimes you can develop that passion through having extra knowledge, because we all feel a little bit passionate about something when we know a little bit more about it. And so hopefully what I'm going to be able to do for you today is give you a little bit more knowledge on some of the work that we've been doing around whole grains, ultra-processed foods, nutrient profiling, and generally how we might combine some of the best parts of all of those philosophies to making some consistent whole grain messages for Australians and perhaps for others around the world. So I'll get started on my presentation and share my screen. Okay, so my title is about supporting whole grain and it's focused on messaging, but we'll take a bit of a roundabout way to get to that as we go through. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from Darawal country. So I'm here in Wollongong, and the Darawal people have very strong connections to the local, the water and the sea and the mountains around us, and the University of Wollongong proudly sits on these lands and acknowledges the traditional custodians as the, I guess, the holders of knowledge. And coming from a university, we think that's very important that we see both of those knowledges as equal. Now, a lot of people who were interested enough to join today probably know a little bit about whole grains already. So we know that whole grains are the whole thing. They include the bran, the endosperm, and the germ, whereas refined grains are only the endosperm. And Australians, like many people around the world, don't really get enough whole grains. And if we look at the research that encourages us on how many whole grains we should be consuming, it's only around 30% of Australians on any one day who'll meet that target for getting enough whole grains in their diet. And even perhaps more alarming than that, there's another 30% of Australians who don't really have any whole grains whatsoever. And of course, recognising that even when we eat whole grains, a small amount of processing is required, particularly in some countries where there may be some more bacteria, or there may be chemicals associated with that very external layer. But as a rule, those losses are only going to be a couple of % of that outer bran layer. In further encouraging, our dietary guidelines encourage us to eat whole grains, and I've just picked some from around the world there. You can see the kind of words that they're telling us to do it. Have mostly whole grain, choose these whole grains, have at least half of your grains as whole. And those messages are pretty consistent no matter where you go to. So there's never really a message that tells you to not eat whole grains, or there's never a message that doesn't support the positive benefits of eating all of those foods. Again, and perhaps a lot of people don't really realise this, and that is that...
Sorry, Eleanor, it seems that the slides are frozen.
Oh, really? Well, let me escape. What slide am I on?
You're still on the first slide. Oh, here we go. I think now we've caught up.
Okay, but I'm not in presentation mode. So should I stay in this mode in order to?
Yes, you're up to health benefits slide.
Correct, but are you seeing it in presentation mode?
No.
No. Okay, I'll try again. Just tell me if it doesn't flick over. Okay. So a lot of people, if you said what are things that are really bad for our health, a lot of people will talk about high fat, high sugar, high salt, but you have a look in terms of CV cardiovascular disease mortality, and you can see that whole grains are up there sort of second in the list. Or sorry, they're actually first in the list for cardiovascular disease, but of course there's some other diseases that might be associated with it that makes high sodium diets take over. And you'll see that things like high sugar sweetened beverages is kind of way down the bottom there. And similarly, if we look at the disability adjusted life years there, a diet low in whole grain is most likely to give you some kind of condition that may reduce your lifespan. Okay, I'm just changing the slide, Kathy. So just tell me, did it change?
No.
Okay. Well, I don't know what.
Maybe just pop out of presentation mode.
I'll pop out of presentation mode and I'll take it to a really.
Absolutely, you're right there now. It's perfect.
Okay. And I'll just turn off my Outlook then, because you don't want to see all my emails pop in. Okay. So we know that whole grains are good for us, and I guess a lot of the work that I'm doing is around encouraging people to eat more whole grains and also try and question why they may not be eating enough. Some of the work that we did, of course now my slides aren't changing. Some of the work we've done in the past around qualitative work are simple studies such as this, where we interviewed consumers and we tried to work out what they understood about whole grains and how they might prefer that they were promoted to them. And the picture I put on the side there, I almost do with an irony, which is that the amount of whole grains that is contained in a food, you know, if you're a dietitian or if you're working in whole grains, you want to say, oh, have 3 serves a day. But we found these consumers didn't know at all what a serve was, and that was one of the big problems. So from a nutritional perspective, these consumers didn't prioritize whole grains at all. If they saw a message on a packet, they understood things like low sugar, low fat, low GI, but they didn't feel that they ever saw a message around eating more whole grains. Even though we tried to show them what those messages might look like or what the labels might look like, they felt that that wasn't something that they were looking for. They were generally unfamiliar with precisely what a whole grain was, and they certainly had no idea what a serve was. And some people who felt that they maybe weren't eating whole grains actually were eating some whole grains as well. And they were also open to changing their intake if they kind of knew the rationale for it. So they all thought that once we told them what those healthier foods were or whole grain foods were, then that would make them more encouraged to choose them as well. So that's, you know, that was some early messages that we could get around what the problems might be. So then we tried to look at what are some of the other ways that we encourage people to make healthy choices. So we've got those dietary guidelines that I mentioned before, and that is our nutrient profiling system. So things like the Health Star rating. So the Health Star rating has, for those of you not familiar with the precise nuances, it of course has positive points and negative points. And it's always, with the Health Star rating, it's the opposite to the way you think it should be. And that is that a negative or a low total is a good thing. And that's how we calculate what score they might get. But there can be some problems with this system. And some of you might know the Health Star rating doesn't include whole grain foods. And it means that this doesn't match dietary guidelines. And we might be concerned about this because if we look back to some of the work that's been done in the past around nutrients versus whole foods, we see that you shouldn't just look at nutrients, that sometimes it's helpful to consider the way something is made up. So don't just look at the fibre that's in whole grain foods, for example. Have a look at the the other things, the other components of it as well. So we know that kilojoules are not necessarily equal, and we kind of have this question about, does fibre equal whole grain? And work by Dr. Eden Barrett, who was one of my PhD students, looked at the difference between cereal fibre and whole grain. And all of her work basically showed that although a massive chunk of the goodness of whole grains could be accounted for by the cereal fibre. So I'm not going to sit here and malign cereal fibre. I'm very pro cereal fibre, but a lot of it, some extra benefits could be maintained from whole grain as well. So the general thought is that cereal fibre contributes a lot of the positive benefits of eating a whole grain food, but there are some other things that you get by eating that whole grain, particularly some vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients as well. Why wouldn't we have whole grains? Like if it's in every dietary guideline, we ask the question, why wouldn't we have it? And from my perspective, most certainly, we found that one of the biggest things that is used as a bit of an excuse is about whether or not you should have it because it's difficult to measure. And, but if you look at something like the Health Star rating, it measures the fruit, vegetable, nuts, legumes content. So how do we measure that? We only measure that by understanding ingredients as well. Some work that was done by GLNC, our lovely host today, and Associate Professor Sarah Grafnauer, who's now at UNSW, looked at trying to differentiate between whole grains and refined grains, and whether the Health Star rating did a good job of that. So they looked at all the products that were on board and tried to work out, was Health Star rating doing a good job? And they generally found that there weren't significant results there. So you'll see with the breads and cereals, there was a bit of a better differentiation with some of the cereals, but not so much with some of the breads. And so what that means is that because you're getting some of these scores done just on the fibre content or just on the protein content, for example, when they're not containing things like fruits, vegetables, that kind of thing, you're not really, it's very hard to say that a whole grain cereal is better than a high fibre cereal, which might have been a little bit more reconstituted in some kind of way. Now, look, I just want to be really clear up front that I'm not even, anti-refined grains in many contexts. A lot of the research says that we can have some of our refined grains, and also, of course, if you look at dietary guidelines in the US, they even encourage that if you are eating refined grains, to make sure that they're fortified foods. And I kind of mention that because it's something that I'll touch on later when we're talking about some of the things related to fortification. And so we said, okay, what can we do about it? I think successive groups of people have tried to get whole grains included in the Health Star rating, but I was part of the Whole Grain Initiative working party, and through that I met some colleagues who were trying to do some work around the Nutri-Score system. The Nutri-Score system, I'll explain, is very similar to the Health Star rating, but it's just something that's used very commonly in Europe. And we tried to think, okay, well, what could we do? Should we add some extra points on? Should we just say that, do we give them lots of points for whole grain? And if they've also got high cereal fibre, maybe that could be an alternative to give them lots of points. We tried to think, well, what would be the cutoff? Like, how would we decide how many points to give people? And we decided to do, to use the Whole Grain Initiative, the new definitions. So we said that a 50% food could be called a whole grain food, and a minimum level of whole grain that you might want to aim for in a food to show some benefit might be around 25%. And this is work that's all been totally led by my PhD student, who has submitted now, Katrina Kissock, and you'll see that her publication down there. But we came up with that if a food could score 5 points, in the algorithm that is Nutri-Score. So remembering very similar, but just the way the points add up to different ratings is a bit different, but they're looking for very similar things. So if you had 100% whole grain, we gave you 5 points. If you had 50% or more, you got 3 points for that food. For whole grain, you got 1 point, it was 25% or more, but if it was less than 25%, we didn't count that at all. And you'll see that you don't have to understand the complexities of this graph, because I know when people just suddenly put up a graph, everyone goes, oh, well, what is it? It's really just showing that we were able to show, of course, as you would expect, a better correlation with the percentage of whole grain in a food when we added whole grain as a nutrient and similar, or as a component of the food, I should say. And similarly, if we look at the UK data, because we applied this to Australian, UK, US and French foods, and we could see that the cereal fibre correlations didn't really change with the modified Nutri-Score. So you can see that they're down there at sort of 0.226. But we were increasing the correlation when we looked at the whole grain percentage. So what that kind of told us, or what we were able to look at, was that for various foods, and here's just examples from Australia and the UK, a lot of foods changed points, but only a few of them changed categories in the Nutri-Score class. So that would be equivalent to a few of them going from like 4 to 5 stars in particular was what we found. But it was a decent number of foods that may give consumers a slightly better direction that these whole grain cereal breads type products really are potentially better than those that are not whole grain. So then we've kind of looked at dietary guidelines, we've looked at front of pack labeling, and then we were kind of wondering what are the other buzzwords? How else are consumers getting these messages around whole grain foods and what choices they should make? And of course, one of the things that came straight up was the level of processing, because food industry is always getting in trouble for having processed foods. Yet we know that in most modern food systems, we can't all just suddenly go out and start growing our own wheat and having our cow in the backyard. So some of those systems are unrealistic. However, as a dietitian, I feel generally that I want to encourage foods to be relatively as least processed as possible. So the system that I think, it doesn't get called this in the media, but in science circles, everybody is using the term ultra processed foods. And the term ultra processed foods came from Carlos Montero and his group in South America, where they divided foods based on their uses more so. So a minimally processed food, will include things like, sugars, salts, things that are minimally processed. We have processed culinary ingredients, things that you might use to cook with in the home. We then have some of those foods that are processed. So they might be mixtures of foods that have some of those minimally processed foods and culinary ingredients. And then we have the ultra processed foods. And ultra processed foods include, to some degree, the simple way of defining them would be to look at your labels in the supermarket and say, are those ingredients unavailable, something you'd find in your pantry? And of course, if we go to a loaf of bread or a packet of cereal, you'll see a whole heap of things. There might be some thickeners, there might be some preservatives in some, there might be some added nutrients like vitamin B12 or iodine might be in your bread. And so those foods get classified as ultra processed food. And just to be clear, that if I was to make a cake at home with exactly the same nutrient profile in terms of protein, saturated fat, refined sugars, that food wouldn't be ultra processed. But if I was to buy a cake in the supermarket in packaging, it would be classified as an ultra-processed food. So the NOVA system is not about nutrients. And of course, as I mentioned before, many nutrition scientists have been accused of being reductionist and only looking at nutrients. And so that system says, this is better for you, and it talks about things like environmental sustainability. It talks about the fact if you've baked the cake, how, you know, it might be eaten in a communal environment and everybody sitting down together and enjoying the food, as opposed to very fast, easy, packaged foods. So it's one of the big things where I would say NOVA has some beautiful philosophies encouraging those kind of things. At the moment, and there's been a paper published recently that I probably should have popped in this slide, but at the moment, there's been some research showing that this particular system is incorporated less commonly into dietary guidelines. And there are certainly many, many studies that link an increased ultra-processed food intake with chronic disease. So not denying any of that. And if you think about it, your automatic reaction would be that whole grains are not very processed by definition. And therefore, if NOVA is about trying to have less processing, wouldn't those systems be consistent? But unfortunately, that isn't the case. So I just want to, again, put up front that I would never encourage people to have a diet of really highly processed foods, and we generally would tell people not to eat them. And there's certainly this evidence that the ultra-processed foods, you know, in cross-sectional studies show these links. But we've also got that other evidence that tells us that high whole grain foods are linked with improved health outcomes as well. So the problem is that if you look at a slice of bread, and I picked a brand there that, you know, might be seen as really positive and that we would encourage people to consume. It's both whole grain and, you know, has some other bits and bobs in it as well. It gives you about 43 grams of whole grain, so close to all the whole grain that's recommended you absolutely need in a day in only 2 slices. It's fortified with thiamine, iodine, folic acid. Yet NOVA tells us that it's ultra processed, and that is not consistent with the Australian Dietary Guidelines. Secondly, you have a very, this is my way, I was in Fiji on holidays last week. This is my way of getting a holiday shot in, that I went to a supermarket and this was the only cereal that was available that I could see. There was some oats, but the only packaged cereal was this one in that supermarket. So you have a food that's 97% whole grain. It's fortified with those nutrients that I've listed there. And just remembering that it's specifically, you know, when folate fortification or folic acid fortification came in Australia, we've got good evidence of the benefits that Australians received from that. But again, NOVA classification, it's classed as an ultra-processed food, even though it's a core food within the Australian Dietary Guidelines. And the people who are very pro-NOVA at this point just totally say our dietary guidelines are wrong and we need to change them. So we tried to do a little bit of work because we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We don't want to sit here and ignore evidence that tells us that eating highly processed foods may have some negative health consequences. But as a whole grain researcher, I wanted to try and look at, okay, but which of the foods, what's happening, and which ones of them are, which are the anomalous foods? So which are the ones like those examples I just gave to you? And if we were to try and cut out some of those foods, what is going to happen to the diets of Australians if we remove those and just start having a diet? If the dietary guidelines is wrong, how do we change our dietary guidelines to be consistent with that? And so we looked at a data set which removed the ultra-processed food and one which kept them in. We used data from the Health Survey 2011 to 2012 as actually the dietary parts of it. And we tried to consider which foods contributed to whole grain consumption in particular, and also looked at quintiles of whole grain and ultra-processed food intake. When we look at ultra-processed food intake, we look at the energy contribution. So if somebody eats about a quarter of their weight in food as ultra-processed food, we would look at what's the energy contribution of that. So it might be a 50% energy contribution is ultra-processed food, depending on what particular foods they were eating. So we found, of course, that if you remove those foods, and remembering that in this first instance, we weren't replacing those foods, but we showed that Australians were getting only about 40% of their whole grains from foods, which, according to the NOVA classification, would not be ultra-processed foods. So a lot of whole grains that Australians were eating were ultra-processed food. And only if we removed ultra-processed foods without, because the expectation, of course, would be that then people would have to be potentially making their own bread at home, or they would be having to eat oats for breakfast as opposed to any other breakfast cereal. Only 4% of people would automatically be getting enough whole grains in their diet. So we then tried to look at what were the correlations between the ultra-processed food intake and the dietary fibre intake. And we saw that there was a lovely correlation with that. So the people that were eating the most ultra-processed food tended to have the least dietary fibre in their diets. And we probably would have expected that. But when we looked at the ultra-processed food correlation with whole grain, we found that we didn't get a nice linear curve. And that's a flag to say, hang on, NOVA and whole grain aren't in sync. And again, it doesn't mean that one or the other is right, but they're certainly not in sync. So if you look at this kind of graph, the people that had this table, the people that had the most ultra-processed food intake on the right with the star, their average intake of grams per 10 megajoules per day was only around 32 grams of whole grain. And if you compare that to the people that had the least ultra-processed food, they were getting about 44 grams of ultra-processed food. But the problem is, you can see that that's not linear, because for the whole, even though there's equal numbers in each of those quintiles, there's no difference between quintile 1 and 2, and only a little bit of a difference down to 3 and 4, whereas there's a big jump to 5. And what that starts to tell us potentially is that, there might be a problem there may be a problem with if whole grains is a measure of dietary quality, as is ultra-processed foods, it may be that we need to have a look at the way that ultra-processed foods being classified, because maybe the really high whole grain ultra-processed foods, shouldn't be part of that, shouldn't be maligned in any way. They shouldn't get a negative message for them. So then we did some dietary modelling. We looked at the foundation diet, which we base our dietary guidelines on. We looked at the NOVA diet. So this is a diet where we excluded all ultra-processed foods. And then we looked at the current dietary patterns that were shown to be the case in the Australian Health Survey, the most recent one. And we also did some modelling on some breakfast meals. You can see there that some of them followed the Australian Dietary Guidelines, and some of them were the type of foods that we felt we could have consumers have without breaching those kind of NOVA guidelines. So when we did that, so for the full day dietary modelling, we found that the fortified nutrients, of course, were much lower in the NOVA diet to the Australian Dietary Guidelines, but you will see that the worst diets were what Australians were currently eating. So we know that Australians don't follow dietary guidelines. So they actually sometimes get less of some of those nutrients. But when we look specifically at breakfast, you can see with that breakfast modelling, there's some whole grains there that if you choose to have porridge, then you're going to actually get more whole grains than you're having from a lot of other things. But actually you're going to get a fair bit less of some other nutrients, and that's because those aren't fortified. And so particularly things like, you look at the iron there, so a lot of Australians will get a lot of iron from their breakfast cereals, and you can follow the Australian Dietary Guidelines and you'll get, generally speaking, you'll get really good nutrients, a range of nutrients there, so including whole grains, dietary fibre, etc. And again, I had porridge for breakfast this morning. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have porridge. I'm just saying that we need to be really aware before we push any single message, we need to be really aware of the consequences of that message. And in this particular situation, if we look at folic acid fortification, for example, there was a 77% reduction in people with low serum, increase in the mean serum, but most critically, if we looked at the incidence of neural tube defects, you'll find that they decreased overall in all women, but in at-risk population, which was Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders and teenage women, there was a massive decrease in the number of neural tube defects when mandatory folic acid fortification came in. So if we go back over to here and we look at the folate that you might get if you only followed the NOVA guidelines, you'll see that you're going to get a lot less folate than if you were to follow the, a broader or have a mixture, where one day you had porridge and one day you had other breakfast cereals. So it's not, when we're talking about these things at a population level, we don't need to panic about every single person, because it's not every single person that is going to be at risk. I have privilege, I know how to cook, I'm a dietitian, I can do things like know what foods to choose to get folic acid, even if I don't have breakfast cereal. The at-risk groups are those that may have other disadvantage, particularly poor dietary practices or limited access to healthy, fresh foods. So, if you live in a more remote community, for example, or a rural area even, then you won't be able to access lots of fresh fruits and vegetables. And it may be more important that you're getting your folic acid, for example, from your fortified breakfast cereal. So I guess we published that study in the European Journal of Nutrition, and I guess what we want to say from it is that we think the next step is to consider whole grain quantities of food in NOVA. So to not just say they're bad because they're whole grain and they're a little processed, but it's also a challenge for food industry to think, okay, is there some reformulation we can do that might decrease some of those ingredients that some researchers are now telling us may not be ideal. And it may just be that it's a blunt instrument. So NOVA is not sensitive to fortified foods, but it doesn't mean that all of the foods that are categorized as ultra-processed foods are the same. And if we're ever going to think about incorporating things like processing foods into public health advice, we need to be really, really careful that we're not just creating another mixed message. So you actually can't promote NOVA and the current dietary guidelines. They don't fit together really well. So the last bit of work, and this is something that we're just working on at the moment, my honours student Natasha worked on it last year, to correlate, to look at the data in relation to some of the health outcomes. And we use those definitions of the 50% whole grain to look at, if we take out the foods that are 50% whole grain from the ultra processed food category, so we say actually they're not bad, they're fine for you, what kind of negative correlations with health measures do we get? And our initial work tells us that it makes no difference taking them out, which is exactly what we'd hope to show. And that is that if you take those whole grain foods out, that it doesn't make any difference. We're just repeating that work with some extra statistical modelling in it, and hope to publish it later this year. But yeah, we certainly think that if we look at this graph, you'll get a bit of a picture for it. You'll see that that yellow line was representing some of that original work where we didn't get a linear relationship. Whereas if you take out the high whole grain foods, then you start to get a much better picture for showing that maybe you can take high whole grain foods out and then you get a much better relationship with whole grain intake and percentage energy from ultra processed foods. So that's where we're at the moment. So yeah, in summary, yeah, so NOVA highlights foods which are not good for improved health outcomes. That's true, but we don't think that whole grain food should necessarily be part of that. So we need to balance that in any system that refers to processing, and not to throw out all those good benefits we know people get from whole grains and we know people have got from fortification of foods. So I guess as a final summary, whole grains are good for us, and they're probably more so than just cereal fibre. And we think that food recommendations shouldn't be only nutrient focused. So there are some benefits to look at broader processing, and certainly to look at things like whole grain. But the whole food classification thing is complex, and it's not easily translated to consumer messaging. So when we're working as health professionals or in food industry, for example, we really want to be careful that our messages are not oversimplified, and also that we don't totally just say one is better than the other, because neither of those things are necessarily helping our consumers make better choices to have healthier diets. Just wanted to acknowledge a whole group of people here, particularly the work that's done by honours students Maddie and Tasha. All of the nutrient profiling work is Katrina's work, and some of the things with the cereal fibres versus whole grains come from Eden's thesis, and Marika and Liz Neal are people who've co-supervised some of those students with me. And to acknowledge the international team that worked on the Nutri-Score data, and also Sarah, who did some parts of the work, and particularly a couple of slides in this presentation about the refined and whole grain foods. And I think that's everything that I needed to say. Thanks, Kathy.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Ellen. I didn't actually realise it was so complex. Yeah, I think it's definitely opened up my eyes. I think, you know, thinking that we're in a process at the moment with the review of the Australian Dietary Guidelines, and now sort of having a look at all this information that you've presented, you know, what in your view would be a logical way of using all these tools to their best benefit, you could say, to help influence the dietary guidelines?
Absolutely. Look, I just think that the processing of foods has done wonders for society and being able to feed people and avoid malnutrition. And we all know, though, that in a world of excess, so not everywhere has excess, but many countries have excess, then we're really changing the formula for, you know, for what's good. And our bodies get messed up and then things change. So some of the messages, for example, that we say are fine for the general public might be different if someone already has disease. So from a processing perspective, I think that we do need to recognise how can we put those things together. So if a food is really processed, and one of the people I've worked with is Professor Julie Jones from the US, and she always calls them the Twinkie Donkey something foods, you know, these kind of, you know, donuts with cream that come and would have a 6-week lifespan in a plastic packaging. They are highly, highly processed and give us no nutrients. So we all know that they're bad, and we all know that many of those foods might contribute to these negative things. In contrast, we have this really good evidence around whole grains and the way that our consumers, you know, many bits of evidence that show even that people who have breakfast are more likely to have better nutrient profiles for the rest of their day, and more likely to have improved health outcomes, particularly if they're choosing whole grain types foods for breakfast. So I think the dietary guidelines are correct in encouraging whole grain. And I personally don't mind if they also talk about trying to avoid highly processed foods, but I don't think breads and cereals, and there's probably a few other foods, but I don't exactly know about them because I'm a whole grain researcher. I don't believe they are highly processed foods. I believe they are foods that are generally processed to the best of their ability to deliver the most nutrients. I also think, and I think there's a question in the chat there. Someone said, oh, I didn't know Weet Bix were ultra processed. don't get that as my message. That isn't my message. I eat Wheat Bix. When I'm not eating porridge, I eat Wheat Bix for breakfast. That they are not ultra processed. They're 97% whole grain. They've hardly got any ingredients in them. They're good for you, but it just it's just a little glitch in these classification systems that we need to be really aware of. So yeah, I think have whole grains in there, have a bit of a message about processing. But my problem is just with this NOVA system that really pushes that, this is the correlation and all processing is bad. I personally think that's not quite true. And I think our research is starting to show it. And for anybody who's a member of the American Society for Nutrition, I was just telling Kathy beforehand, the great debate on overnight between Carlos Montero, who developed the system for NOVA, and David Ludwig, who's a big cardiovascular, lifestyle disease person, was having this exact debate. So it's not just here in Australia us talking about it, it's a much bigger thing. And so I think the two systems, so not NOVA as it stands, but a modified NOVA and the whole grain argument can sit together. I just think we need to tweak that. And yeah, I've got a PhD student at the moment who's going to try and do that. We're going to try and do it with the Australian data and also that from the US, so the NHANES survey there. And hopefully what we'll be able to show is that if you look at some of the other really good qualities of food, such as whole grain, then that could be a reason to not class them as an ultra-processed food.
Absolutely. Really encouraging anyone on the call, if they have any other questions, to please come forward with any questions. I think from what I can see already, this is going to be an ongoing piece of work for you and for other researchers in this space. I think it's an interesting one, and having myself spent a large part of my career working in food industry, I know, as I've always said, there's processing and there's processing, and it's a fine line between them as to when you would call something ultra processed versus processed. As at the end of the day, some foods we really do need to process before we can consume them, for edibility reasons, but also some of them for safety reasons as well.
Absolutely. And even if we do need to start looking at some food reformulation, as health advocates, we still need to be realistic that you can't just get rid of stuff, and that people, I think it's quite elitist to think that one of the recommendations is that, if bread in packaging is bad for you, well, you can have homemade bread. Well, who necessarily has the time and skills to do that? And I would argue it's people with more money and resources. And they're not the people that are having the major health problems anyway. So we need to, as health advocates, we need to be really realistic. We need to be realistic, and we need to also be thinking of unintended consequences. And that's what some of our work with the modelling around folic acid showed, that if we've made all these gains to have massive decreases in incidence of things like spina bifida and other neural tube defects, why on earth is that a bad thing? So, we need to think about that.
Absolutely. I think there's another question for you there. Does Eleanor think there should be a separate labelling claim for high in whole grains?
Absolutely. Absolutely, I think there should be. And Katrina's, the other part of her thesis, and we've just done some revisions to the paper now, but the other part of her thesis even looked at what consumers wanted in that message. So what did they want? They don't, I can tell you they don't want grams. That's really confusing to them. They don't want serves because they don't know what that is. They would, and even high in whole grain or very high, they can be a little bit dubious about that because, high compared to what? They quite liked percentages. So if you knew that this food was 55% whole grain, you knew exactly where you stood. Even if you didn't know numbers really, you knew that it was mostly whole grain. But if you just said that that same food was high in whole grain, or, had a serve of whole grain, so maybe it was 16 grams of whole grain and a 30-gram piece of bread, even though that's exactly the same thing, our consumers liked percentages. So we're hoping to have that published very soon.
Fantastic, fantastic. We'll definitely look forward to that. Is there any other questions before we close off? No? I think everyone's overwhelmed like me.
Well, it is very confusing, and I get confused all the time as well, but I just don't think that the, 50 years of research we have that shows us all the benefits of eating whole grain can be wrong. And the majority of those studies are done in populations that are getting their whole grains from breakfast cereals in bread. So I just don't believe they're wrong. That's all. That's a good way to end.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for your time, Eleanor, and I think we'll definitely be watching you closely to see how all this progresses. It's definitely a very hot topic, I think, across the whole industry. And yeah, thank you for continuing your research in this space.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining. We will have this, obviously it's been recorded, so you'll be able to review it and go through it in more details. And I'm sure if you have any specific questions, Eleanor would be more than happy to reply to those. So send anything else through and we'll make sure that gets to Eleanor.
Yeah, no problem at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, go and eat some more whole grains.
Yeah, absolutely. See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.